All right, this is the Take Command Podcast. Logan Paulsen there, Craig Hoffman here, and we are live with you on YouTube at the Team 980, at Craig Hoffman, and at 1067 The Fan. Of course, if you're listening to this later on the audio, we told you we might do this. This is why you got to subscribe wherever it is if you want to be able to join us live. So wherever you're watching or listening right now, make sure you've hit that subscribe button. And we will do this occasionally, pop up live if there's breaking news or, for instance, a dynamic news situation like we're in right now, where if we record a podcast at 11 a.m. and put it out by 12:30, there's a chance that something else happened and well, it's dated. We don't want to do that. That said, about 15 minutes from now, we are going to try to do a little bit of predicting, a little bit of foreshadowing in terms of what we think the Commanders still have on their to-do list. So we will try our best to discuss that, knowing that they could sign someone 5 seconds after we sign off and make that part of the conversation at least some point moot. Let's take a look at some of the other guys, though. And Logan, let's start on the D-line because they make multiple signings here. I think we talked some about the Javon Kinlaw thing when you joined me live on the radio the other day. Yeah, we did, because he was the first guy in. But to me, the theme of the guys that they've signed is they're going after the big bodies. And you and I talked about this last training camp, where we walked out on the practice field and we're like, that's an Adam Peters guy. That's an Adam Peters guy. That's an Adam Peters guy. Because they were all the big dudes. And between Kinlaw, who's 6'5", 320, Eddie Goldman, who they signed, the nose tackle, played most of his career with the Bears, last year with the Falcons. He's 6'5", 330. He's a mountain of a man. You played with him in Chicago. And then late last night, they signed Deatrich Wise, who was a 5-sack guy last year for the Patriots, played very well for them for quite a while, 6'5", 280-pound defensive end. It seems like they are, I don't know how great of run players these guys are, but at the very least, they're going to have some bulk this year to, I think, not have the line of scrimmage moved in the way it was in the past.
Yeah, and I think you're just getting players who, again, like one of the big weaknesses for the Commanders, I think, was, run defense. So I think when you go out and sign a guy like Goldman, that's like his superpower. When you watch his film, he's a big guy, but he's got enough twitch and enough burst to kind of create some knockback. He understands kind of what it takes to sit and split a double team, which is extremely important. And because of the athletic upside of a guy of his size, he can penetrate a little bit. And so I do think when you're looking for a guy that maybe can keep Bobby Wagner clean, keep Frankie Louvu clean, keep that other kind of big Buffalo nickel safety type player clean in the box, he's going to do that, but he also has some playmaking upside. Now, he's 30 years old or whatever he is. He's not in his prime any longer, but he still can throw that pitch at a very high level, and I think that's extremely important. When you look at Wise, man, he's been honestly one of my favorite players to watch over the last probably 5 years in the NFL. He is a big dude like you were talking about. He's okay against the run, but as a stand-up defensive end, I think he does a little bit better. He can put his hand in the dirt, but he also has some pass rush juice. He has some ability to kind of do the dance of a pass rusher. And to me, he's a perfect replacement to Cleveland Farrell. And I actually think he's a little bit more of a competent football player, right? So when you're in this 4-down front, you get a guy who's just slightly more aware, has a little bit more pass rush upside, kind of understands when to throw those different moves. You can loop him on a stunt. He's got a good feel for getting after the passer. And so I think adding those two pieces are just two solid football players, right? Two really solid high floor football players that on a 1-year deal, what are they, $6 million each, something like that?
Wise was $5 million. I think Goldman's right around the same, 5 or 6.
Yeah. So that, to me, that's a perfect fit, right? They're guys that they're good pros. They elevate your defense right now. They help you in areas that you were struggling with last year, and they just bring a level of consistency that you need on the defensive side of the football, like we talked about when we were kind of doing the defensive review of how the defense played over the course of last season. Then you look at Kinlaw, and I was going through his film and kind of watching plays, and is he an up and down player? Yeah, but he does have something very unique, something that's you can't coach, and that's the physical explosiveness and power. And if you can harness that and get it going in the right direction, that could really, really be a nice piece. And I think you look at the things you talked about, Darryl Tapp knows him, Adam Peters knows him, Jeff Ulbrich and Robert Saleh, who Dan Quinn knows really, really well, probably endorsed him at a high level. So they understand exactly what they're getting here. And when you watch the highs of Kinlaw, you're like, man, this guy could be something extremely special. Now, there's inconsistency to his play, but I look at that and I say, if you get him in the right role, you mentioned him maybe playing that big power end in this defense, potentially. We don't know for sure, but that's something on the table. And I think about him matching up with a tackle on the open side edge and him just denting edges, being physical, using his length and size and speed. Like that is a devastating proposition. Then you can bump him inside on third down and just say, hey man, pin your ears back and go get it. And I'm like, dude, that's exciting. Now, a lot of things have to fall in place for that, but I think that's why you trust Daryl Tapp, you trust Ryan Kerrigan to maximize somebody who, like there's that, what is it, the Bill Parcells, like the world principle. There's only a couple people on the planet Earth that look and move like Kinlaw. And I can honestly say that he's a very unique player in that regard. And I think fans will fall in love with him the first second he walks on the field at training camp because of that size frame stuff. But if you get him, that's a plus player with two players in the front that are very, very solid. Goldman and Wise are very, very solid players. And like that sounds like I may be being pejorative towards them, but they're good. They're just good NFL football players that make your team and raise the floor of the defense just from these signings. So I love all of these signings. I love the upside play of Kinlaw, but I love the floor that Wise and Goldman present.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out, like, these guys are all going to be rotation players. Like, none of these guys are going to be relied upon to play 900 snaps. Like, these are all 400 to 600 snap guys that hopefully can play their best on a very consistent basis because they are going to be fresh all the time. And, like, Goldman's going to be in a rotation with Kinlaw and Newton and Payne and maybe another young guy. And then on the edge, you have Wise, you have Armstrong, and then they'll probably, Kinlaw maybe is out there some too, Jean Baptiste, and then they probably sign another guy or two, or that could be their first round pick is an edge in the draft. Obviously, I think a lot of people, I would say myself included, hope that is one of the directions that is available to them at the 29th pick or the 30 whatever pick if they can trade back and recoup some draft capital. So I think that's an important thing to point out. The other thing about Kinlaw specifically, because he's the only guy that they've gone multi-year on here, which is something I do want to talk about in a second. We got a really good question in the YouTube chat kind of about this. But $15 million a year for Javon Kinlaw is the going rate for a rotational starting caliber defensive piece, right? A guy who's kind of that fringe starter, like high end backup, low end starter guy. And because of the way the cap has gone, raising $20 million a year the last 2 years, this is the equivalent to like an $11 million a year deal 2 years ago. Literally 2 years ago, if you look at cap percentage. So if I told you that they signed Javon Kinlaw to an $11 million deal per year, I don't think anyone blinks twice. They're like, yeah, okay. Like that's what happens for veteran backups at an expensive position. And realistically, we just have to get our brains around the fact that the cap has gone up and these guys are just going to be a little bit more expensive, but it's not actually hurting the team in any kind of way. And in that way, stop counting other people's money. Good for Javon Kinlaw. Hope that he, in his generational wealth or whatever charities he supports or whatever, that money goes to good uses. So at the end of the day, like I think that, and also they've got plenty of cap space to do whatever else they want. So this is not inhibiting them in any kind of way. And I think what it's done is provided them with an even more solid floor. If you think like Wise is an upgrade over Furl, et cetera, they still have to probably find that other edge piece, and whether that's re-signing Fowler or a couple other guys that we can talk about. But they've also, I think, given themselves some more versatility. Like they tried to do some of the odd spacing stuff last year, and they did it. They did some funky stuff, and a lot of teams are doing this, right? They play like kind of even spacing and an odd front where they just tack another guy on the end of the line of scrimmage. But now if they wanted to play a true like 3-4 for whatever reason, they like the matchups, they think another team's runs really struggle against those fronts. Like Eddie Goldman being a true nose or a guy that can play a true shade provides you a different option. And for a defense that's super multiple, Logan, I think that's pretty exciting.
No, I do think that'll be interesting to see what they do. And I think that's one of the things, I love your analogy you made earlier about the kind of evaluating a picture that's being drawn. They could do that. Yeah. And we talked about how they have that install in where they can, play a 3-4. But I also think like Goldman would be great playing a shade. Like he would be great just playing like in a 4-down front, playing a shade, playing off the center's shoulder, and he'd probably be more effective there. And then you get Payne playing a true 3 technique, or Johnny Newton playing a true 3 technique where they can penetrate and be aggressive because you've got this guy who can eat that front side double. Or you've got Kinlaw playing the end and he can really dent that edge down and really collapse that thing in and force them back into, Goldman, Payne, Newton on the interior. So I do think there is, I think there's a lot of stuff they can do. And I think that's one of the exciting parts about this point of the season is I like the football players they signed. I like the roles they fit. I like when I watch the film, I like what they're about. I like the measurables. That's great. But I also just like when you watch Wise, man, you see a guy who loves ball. He's physical. He's aggressive. He's passionate. He's energetic. He's animated. Like, that's what I want this team to be. When I watch Kinlaw, I see an explosion of athletic potential. And so now it's like, where does it all fit? How does it all come together? Yeah. Could it be a 3-4 like we talked about when we did that 3-4 show? Absolutely. Maybe it's maybe it's a 4 down front, or maybe it's a true under with a Sam on the ball. Like, who knows what this sucker looks like, but they got they got football players. And that makes me confident that they can kind of get into whatever they need to maximize this group and kind of present the best defense moving forward. And I think that's the other thing. Like last year, there was, what are they doing? Like, this feels very clear. It's like we're going to get guys that are physical, that have some pass rush upside, that fill in some of our gaps. Like I think about Carl Davis last year, how he's kind of this late signing to help kind of manage some of the stopping the run issues that the defense was having. Like Goldman, like that's his thing. Like that's what he's been doing since he came into the NFL. And when you watch his film, it shows up as a guy that not only can stop the run, but can move laterally down the line of scrimmage at a high level. So I look at this and I say, yeah, like they can do whatever you need them to do, whatever you want them to do. But I do think like they've got good football players, and that makes that possible.
For sure. And speaking of versatility, their back end signings as well, like those are guys that have some of that, and including one of Deatrich Wise's former teammates in New England and Jonathan Jones. And if you can play for Belichick, you can do anything. Yeah. Because and those are two of Belichick's favorite guys because of the versatility they did bring. And so Jonathan Jones on the back end corner, who played a lot of slot early in his career, moved outside the past couple of years. His worst year was probably last year, but like he went from playing in a Bill Belichick defense to Gerard Mayo and whatever they were doing in New England, which was generally a disaster last year, which is why that staff is no longer there. So yes, he is getting older. Yes, he is on the wrong side of the age cliff for a corner, but he's an intriguing piece. And apparently he's a stand-up, like A+ dude. And I think having that kind of guy who's a little bit older in a room with Marshawn Lattimore to where Mikey Sainer still isn't necessarily having to take the full burden of the leadership responsibility. And by the way, as you're grooming your future leaders, like we talked about with a guy like Marcus or whoever else on offense to kind of show Jaden the way, having another example in the room for Mikey is fantastic in terms of his long-term growth and development. I love the Jonathan Jones signing for those reasons. I don't know if he can play or not, and that is something that we should definitely talk about. But I'll also tack on to talk about in this conversation, Logan, for you is Will Harris, who played super versatile last year in New Orleans. I mean, this dude would line up at free safety, line up at strong safety, line up in the box, he'd line up in the slot. He lined up, depending on some certain alignments they had, he'd be an outside corner, typically like more kind of clamped in. He's not like on an island outside, but every once in a while. So they get two more guys that can play a whole ton of places in this defense. And it just screams like, again, they want to have options. They want to be versatile. And then it's a matter of putting the guys in the best positions possible to execute.
Yeah, so I think Jonathan Jones is really interesting, especially because the contract value, what was it, 1 for 5.5?
Yeah, it's 1 for 5.5. Another $1 million potential incentives could get up to 6.5.
And he feels like he's going to be a kind of rotational backup type guy, kind of like your Michael Davis analogous, right? Kind of like your replacement for Benjamin St-Juste, a guy that can play the slot if you have to, can play outside if you need him to. And when I go back and watch his key plays from last year, like I think he's got a lot of things that he does really well. First off, he's crazy explosive and twitchy. Like all those kind of like movement skills you want from a corner, he still has that at a high level. I think he tracks the football. I think he plays the football in the air at a really high level. And so what I mean by that is like I think everyone's familiar with St-Juste and kind of how the ball would be in the air. And it's like he's a little bit lost. Like Jones doesn't have that, right? He's able, even though he's a smaller guy, he's able to play the hands, track the football. He gets a lot of batted balls. He has a fair amount of interceptions in his career. It's interesting because he is, to me, more of a slot player, slot special teams type guy. And maybe that's the role he falls into here, kind of as your punt returner. He played a couple snaps for on offense early in his career, getting reverses and things like that. He's very, very explosive.
I think he was a 4.33 guy coming out. Again, that was a long time ago, but like 4.33, even if you're slow, is like 4.4 now. And I would give a lot to run a 4.4.
Yeah, no doubt. And so when I look at this, I say to myself, like, he's basically your swing secondary player for the outside guys in the nickel. And that's what you want. You want a guy who's a good, competent football player, right? And I'm saying this term a lot, but I feel that way about Goldman. I feel that way about Wise. I feel that way about Jones, like if you need it, like if Sanders still goes out or there's a package where he's playing the nickel, I feel very comfortable putting Jones on the perimeter and having match up. Now, is he going to get beat by bigger wide receivers on occasion? Absolutely. Like when you watch the Jets game, like they throw a couple of jump balls to Mike Williams, and Mike Williams just kind of gets over top. But I will say he's a competitive son of a gun, because on this, there's a drive where they throw a jump ball, they throw an in, and it looks like they're picking on him a little bit. They get down the red zone, they throw a fade to him, and I'll be darned if Jones doesn't punch that thing out and prevent the touchdown, and it leads to a field goal. So he's a competitive, competent football player. Are there limitations to his game? Yes. Like that's why he's on a 1-year, $6 million deal, right? Because he's not a perfect player. He's a little bit older. He's a little bit undersized, but I think he's going to be a very great value add. And I think about some of the limitations that Michael Davis and St. Juste had, and I think he's a significant upgrade over both of those players, right? So I think that's ultimately what you're looking at here. And we'll see what they do at the nickel spot. And maybe he ends up doing that, or maybe Will Harris does that. But I like that they got a guy who's played a lot of ball, got a lot of experience, and has the skill to play significant minutes if you need him to.
I also wonder if they just say, Mikey, you did such a good job outside last year, we're going to keep you there. Like if Jones is a slot guy, like you can, if I guess this is a good point to make, right? If the free agency is about setting the floor, if the worst case scenario is that Mike Sanders still plays outside again and Jonathan Jones is your nickel and then Marshawn's on the other side, like that's not a bad worst case scenario. You can mess with that. And then hopefully you find a corner in the draft, whether it's first, second round, whatever, who can emerge and be like, actually, I'm good enough to play right away. I'm good enough to start. I'm going to go outside. Mikey, you get to kick back inside. And then Jonathan Jones is your dime corner / depth piece. And you can do some stuff with him, or maybe he plays a little bit of safety and some 3 safety set. Like he's a versatile and smart enough and athletic enough dude that you can do some different stuff with him. Same with Mikey. Like those two pieces become, I don't want to say interchangeable, because like Mikey's a young guy who's here for the future, but like for 2025, they're somewhat interchangeable pieces. And so I think that's an exciting thing to say, like, okay, if free agency is about establishing the floor, this guy's definitely not a bad floor to have. I think Harris is an even better player than that. Like I started watching some of his tape the other day. Dude, I really like what I saw from him in New Orleans. Like he's physical. He seems to have pretty good instincts in coverage. His first play of the year last year, Bryce Young throws one right to him. So I don't know how much ball skills are on display for a ball that hits you right in the chest, but like he does have a pick on the first play of the season last year. That was fun first snap to watch. And, considering Chin is gone, now Defoe's gone, he signs in Buffalo. I think they got a starting caliber guy at a pretty decent price. In fact, he's half the cost of Jeremy Chin. And not that Chin might not be a little better. I don't know. He's double the player that Will Harris is. So I think that's a good signing as well.
Yeah, and I kind of put them both in similar buckets. Like I like Will Harris as well, but he kind of is that box kind of big nickel. He can play some safety stuff. I don't know if you love him playing safety, but is a little bit better in coverage than Chin. Like he does a lot of really good stuff. And I put him in a similar bucket to Jonathan Jones. Like I think Will Harris is probably more like starter or role player ready in some of those packages that Chin was in last year. But I do think that, like you said, he takes good angles with the ball. He's physical on tackles. He understands kind of where to fit when he's playing that nickel role. Is he the best in man coverage? No, but is he serviceable? Yeah. Like, is he always going to be a matchup you're always kind of like wringing your hands about a little bit? Yeah, but it's really hard to find elite coverage players that can play the box and play high level man coverage. And I think the interesting thing when you were talking, I had this thought, both of these players are good players, and talk about setting the floor. Like, shoot, you feel like Will Harris was great last year for New Orleans, and so was, to a certain extent, Jonathan Jones. Like, they were really good floor players for a team. But also now, if you were to draft a corner, you could draft, let's say you draft a nickel player, like the kid from Texas or the kid from Georgia, Starks, right? They could come in and play this nickel role, and then Jones all of a sudden can back up on the perimeter. Or Will Harris is kind of the safety, but you draft, maybe a guy that fits your archetype a little bit more, like the guy I just watched. I don't think the Commanders are going to select him, but the safety from Iowa State, who's 6'3", he's 220, a little bit bigger body, a little bit more range. Maybe you draft him for some upside, but you do have great floors here already. So let's say neither one of those players are ready at the gate. You've got really excellent football players. And I think ultimately that's what I feel good about. And I'm going to keep reiterating this point, is that both of these guys are excellent, like really like, and excellent by NFL standards. Because I think everyone thinks excellent is like the top tier of the market, right? Oh, these guys are tremendous. These guys are good football players, right? They can play teams. They can do a lot of different stuff. They play the game the way you're supposed to play it. And so if that's your floor, you feel great about it. Then you have the flexibility to be like, hey, we can upgrade with this piece, or we can upgrade with this piece, or maybe Hamilton makes a jump this offseason. We feel comfortable putting him in this Buffalo. Like, those are all on the table here. But I think it leads to a better competition and just a more fleshed out group from a talent, and not even a talent standpoint, because I think, St. Juice is talented, but just better football players, right? Guys that have a better feel for the game. Both these guys fit that bill.
Better up here. These are guys, they have really gone in, I think Nikki had this stat the other day that the average age of these signings is 30, which scares you a little bit, I think, because, and this has pained me all free agency long to be like, oh my God, these old guys who are 5-ish years younger than me at this point in my life. And I'm sure it pains you even more as someone who's a couple years older and has retired from the NFL and actually played 10 years in the league. It's not like you had a short career. But that's a little old for NFL, but these guys are also at the tail end, or maybe depending on the position and the guy, in the middle of their primes. And mentally, they're solid. There's just going to be a intelligence to this football team that hopefully the physical skill sets are there, but they're not going to have the confidence or the crises of confidence that you had with a Benjamin St. Juice last year.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing that is really tough about the situation for Adam, is that you not only do you have to make sure the team is getting better, but you have to make sure the team is experienced enough to make a run in the playoffs if you have to. If everything works out, you kind of catch that lightning in the bottle again, you're making a run. We need football players who are good enough and mature enough to handle that while also getting younger at the same time. So that's where it becomes extremely, extremely difficult. And we didn't really talk about this with the Laremy Tunsil thing, but I think there's a semi-awareness or an understanding of hey, we need picks this year. We're going to try and keep our 5 as many picks as we can this year, because we know we need young developmental talent on the roster while also maintaining this high floor that we're talking about. So I think that's something that's kind of paradoxical about this group, is bringing in older guys that have some experience that can play football right now is extremely valuable for this group. But you also kind of need to say, hey, where are we getting younger? And I think that's where the Kinlaw thing is really interesting to me, because at 27 years old, he's still got a lot of runway here, and he can be a piece you can build around if he does figure it out.
For sure. And so this brings me to the question from Tyrone in the chat that I thought was a really good one that we should talk about real quick. And then we'll get to the remaining to-do list quickly on the way out, and some names that we're kind of keeping an eye on. But Tyrone asks, do you think this free agency is about the middle between winning and building? Because Kinlaw is the only guy that is on a multi-year deal here. So they're going to keep a ton of cap flexibility going into next year, even if they sign a couple of other guys to one-year deals, right? They do not have a lot of money tied up long-term. We've talked about this with, Rivera's era of drafting, not producing a ton of players that you're looking to extend. And that's where most teams are spending their money, is on their own guys. Washington doesn't have that, which means they need to go get some guys they can call their own. That's why they make the Tunsil trade, is they just don't have that in the building. And then because they never went through a stretch where they were bad and good at drafting, bad at football, good at drafting, which is how the Texans say have built up their roster. Some other teams have built up. You go from being bad to we're now picking 29th in the draft. We have our franchise quarterback and he's too good too quickly to accumulate other high draft picks. They're going to have to get creative here. But I do think that the answer is multifaceted. One, the simplest answer is yes. They are trying to build something. They're trying to maintain the culture, the brotherhood, the intensity, the intelligence, a lot of the foundational things that they want their program to be about are represented in these signings. But they're also doing it in a way that doesn't tie them down long-term, that keeps the flexibility to be able to build. And I would say additionally, outside of that answer, it also just wasn't that good of a free agent class. And I don't think there's going to be a ton of free agent classes that are good moving forward. There's always going to be some level of hole plugging that happens in floor raising, that happens in free agency, especially if, as is expected with the Netflix money and all this other stuff coming in, these economic factors that are allowing the cap to raise, all of a sudden teams aren't having to make as many tough choices because they can re-sign their own guys on the regular. So they're going to have to obviously eventually hit some late round draft picks if they want to truly be great. And they're going to have to get their Fred Warner, their Hufanga, their guys that Adam got, their George Kittle that Adam got in San Francisco. But I think that's my answer to that question in terms of this middle between building and winning. Logan, how would you approach that answer?
I mean, I think that's exactly what you got to do, and it's a unique situation to be in because the team like this is. I don't want to sound mean, but the team last year was ready and they weren't ready at the same time, right? We kind of like Jaden Daniels did tremendous. Like Terry did a great job. Zach Ertz kind of has his career resurgence. The offensive line plays above its skis. The defensive is opportunistic. But I think if you look at it across the board, like just from a talent standpoint, you're like, there's still a lot to be desired just from a pure like horsepower talent standpoint. You compare them to Philly, you compare them to Detroit. So I do think that this front office is very intelligent. I think they understand that, right? So you do kind of have to walk this line of saying, how do we get blue chip talent in the building while making sure we're good enough to win a playoff game? And that's the thing that's really, really hard because I think the knee-jerk reaction by a lot of fans, myself included, would be like, you have to re-sign Jeremy Chin. You have to do it. But here, we can save a couple bucks. We can get back on a one-year deal with Harris. And Harris, to me, the difference between Harris and Chin is, I know fans probably think it's huge. It's negligible.
It's not $8 million huge.
Yeah, it's negligible. So you're not tied into a 2-year deal, right? You still give yourself an opportunity to invest money next year. So the floor still stays treetop high, but we still give ourselves flexibility next year to be like, hey, when this blue chip safety hits the market, player X, right? We can then invest the money in the player that we want as opposed to over-investing in a player that we're not sure about, And I think that's where it's kind of reaffirming your point, just framing it a different way. It's like you have to do both things. You got to make sure the roster continues to improve while not tying yourself in, or the roster has to maintain serviceability while looking for these blue chip pieces, if that makes sense.
100%. And the ability to take on potentially big salary is something that you need to be able to do, right? Because what happens if someone's available at the trade deadline, or all of a sudden Cincinnati, like apparently their asking price for Hendrickson's insane. But what happens?
Which I would ask, which it should be. Like if you're Cincinnati, ask for crazy stuff. Somebody's going to be desperate enough to pay it. But the thing I keep thinking about is like Micah Parsons going to be a free agent next year. If they, you know what I'm saying? And if you want to onboard that talent, that's going to be a max contract for a premium position. Long-term deal, like you need to have some cap flexibility. That's an example. I'm not saying he's going to get out of Dallas. There's no inside baseball there, but just as a name that'll be a free agent next year, like that. This is the type of stuff you got to be thinking about, and I think Adams is thinking about it.
Nobody knew that the Tunsil deal was a thing that could happen. Right. Like you have to have that flexibility.